looking at history, but we are going to do a little bit of a contextual deep dive into one of the most formative critical theories of the past 70 years, which is postmodernism. Over the next couple of weeks, we are going to be looking at different critical theories and start applying them onto our graphic novels, seeing how they have changed the narrative and how the author uses them to get different points across. But really, the graphic novel could not exist without postmodernism, and you'll be able to understand why after this short lecture. It will be much shorter than Tuesdays, I promise. Okay. So postmodernism, even though it sounds like it, is not a time period, but it's a movement, a late 20th century movement that's characterized by broad skepticism and subjectivity, relativism, especially in the areas of philosophy or politics or economics and even art as well, which we're going to look at more today, mainly just questioning the past. So we know that we have these eras of thought. We know that the way that people in the 18th century thought about those in the 17th century was different. And then when we got to the 19th century, like it all just changes. You react or you rebel against sometimes what we see as either traditional or as incorrect or as not rooted in science. I mean, science itself and scientific discovery was a reaction to a lot of the more just sort of spiritualizing and moralizing that people had around the human body, for example, or the natural world. And it launched people into this inquiry, which is why we know about bodies, because they're just like, let's cut them up and find out. So we benefit from these changes, which is great. So again, this postmodernism was largely a reaction against intellectual assumptions of the 17th and 19th century. So they were reacting to some of that more scientific sort of this idea that inherently we could assume that something is certain and objective, and that there's a scientific way to explain reality, that we can explain away everything, which was a really big change from prior to that. If you think about like the Dark Ages and the 1600s and stuff like that. And so this movement, which really came about more in the 60s is when it really crystallized. It stems more from this recognition that reality is not just what we see mirrored through our own understanding, but it's subjectively constructed. So as we try to understand our own reality, and so it's that move away from objective to subjective. Which, if you think about the 18th, 19th century, it was all about like, let's get this down on the books. What is fact? What is truthful? Which again is great. And one of these movements is not better than another. All these movements occur just to question what dominant thinkers in lots of different areas had to say. And so really their main thing was that all truth was relative. It's we're trying to understand our own particular reality, particular personal reality. And so they're not into explanations that claim to be valid for every culture, tradition, or race, etc. It's, again, the relative truth of that person. What seems true to you, what is true for your life, which to some extent, like, we do prescribe to that. Like, we do live in a culturally relativistic society in many ways. I think there's a big struggle there with our own objectivity, especially as Christians. This could be a struggle of understanding, like, yes, this is what you believe in and that's right. We do struggle to say that, and that's okay. And I think it gets difficult when, you and your faith, you're certain in your faith, but that, another person may not accept that as completely objective. So it just gets messy, and we're not going to talk about the philosophy very much, I promise, because that's an area that I don't know if I'm well equipped to keep going on about, and it deals with abstracts, and I hate abstracts. I usually like things that are a little bit more concrete. So their whole thing is that interpretation is absolutely everything. It is all about how you interpret something to be true. And obviously there's a lot of dangers that can come from this, because what can be true if everybody is redefining their own truth? And so there is no true postmodernism is infuriating. I want to look at postmodernism more of like, here's what it opened up for us. Here's what it allowed for us. But at least postmodernists are like, yeah, we know that individuals' truths can be fallible. Like, what you think is true for you doesn't I mean, maybe you are just clouded by whatever's happening and you can't really see that that thing isn't actually true. So there's a lot of paradoxes and a lot of complaints and criticisms of postmodernism that are really valid. But we just want to take away, what did this movement do for us and how does it allow us to look at literature differently? Because again, there's no way that we could be studying graphic novels at all if it wasn't for postmodernism. So when we hear postmodernism, most people go to more of like the output. I'm looking for my water. Where did it go? I lost my water. Oh well. We usually think of the output, so we think of architecture. So here's some great examples of postmodern architecture. Three of these are in LA, actually. There's the Westin Bonaventure on the bottom, the Getty Center, the Frank Gehry Disney Concert Hall, and then the binoculars are another Gehry, actually, that's in Venice, and the bottom left is not in Los Angeles. So hopefully you could identify where that's from. We're more used to that visual output because honestly, postmodern theory is difficult to understand in the first place. So, but this theory touches all areas of the human mind and endeavors, especially academia. So many of our departments would just look drastically different. Philosophy, obviously, but anthropology, sociology, economics, linguistics, literature, art, all of those would be music would be so different. The way that we even approached things in the class, our text would be different, what we studied, how we talked about it would be different. And so the thing that we're most used to is art. So we're just going to use this as a primary example because the departure is not very far from art, and I think postmodern art's a little easier to understand how it works because it is so visual. So oh, it didn't link me up with my dude over here. Here we go. This is where I wanted to go. So most of us have heard of Jackson Pollock, those squiggly paintings. Looks like you did the classic, first grade, second grade art project where you put a marble covered in paint in the box and you like wiggle it around. Hopefully they still do that in schools because that was very fun. Pollock's paintings really prompted people to say like, oh, I could do that. My 4-year-old could do that. But the thing is that they didn't. They weren't the first ones to do it. So Jackson Pollock really redefined contemporary art in the same way that Picasso redefined modern art. So a lot happens after a war. After World War I is when Picasso really took off and revolutionized so much of the way that modern painting worked. And then post World War II is when Jackson Pollock was painting. And so the 50s, 60s is where you saw a lot of these art movements. So he really cared more about the process or the journey of creating the piece, and it being very physically connected to the piece and breaking out of what was traditionally considered just art or good art. And so his process was really interesting. He worked on the floor. He used unstressed raw canvas, which nobody did. He used these industrial materials. He used imagery, but then also non-imagery. He literally just like threw paint on the canvas. He's like stepping on the canvas, as you can kind of see there in that picture. So it just blasted art making beyond the boundaries it had before, and it really liberated so many fellow artists. So a couple of my favorites are de Kooning in the top, and then Franz Klein. This piece is in LACMA if you want to see it, and Rothko, which this one is one of my favorite artists, but Rothko does have some good piece, and LACMA, this one is not it though. Or maybe it is. I don't remember. So this really paved the way for artists to define art in their own way. So much of this is about definition, of stripping down definitions of what is and isn't, and what should or shouldn't be included in something. And usually those in power were the ones who defined it. And so people were really revolutionary of going against whatever the status quo was. And so the natural progression of some of, the freedom that's allowed from this kind of art was just crazy art. So like Dadaism and Surrealism. So we recognize Dali, of course, was a famous Surrealist. And then Marcel Duchamp is another very, very famous Dadaist. And this is one of his most famous pieces, which is just a urinal. But he was able to take this journal and say, this is art. And then people could decide if it's not or if it is. And so there's a lot of power behind definition, which if you've taken my 112 classes, I talk about that a lot. Whoever defines things is the one that holds the power. And so this did just open people up to being able to define it themselves of this thing I'm doing, this is art. And it doesn't have to have one meaning and one interpretation. It can have multiple interpretations, even interpretations that I didn't mean. And so because of these free thinkers, we got things like multimedia art, mixed media art. We got video art, which is incredible to see, performance art, and a lot of fashion, textile arts, fashion arts. I don't know what the name is, or my favorite, installations. I absolutely love installations. I love the sensory aspect of them, but this certainly does not qualify as art like in the 18th century. This would never be qualified as art, even in the 19th century. So let's move over then to our literature. Side note, I hope that you guys were able to go to the Biola Art Gallery before we vacated campus, but there was an incredible installation there that was, I forget what it was called, but they just took the entire gallery space and turned it into like your grandma's living room. And then another part was the Sunday school classroom, and another part was this flannel graph wall. And then there was this like candy shop that was lit up that had like like lollipops and all these things, like a beautiful example of this installation and performance type of art that absolutely wouldn't have existed. But I think a lot of people went into that gallery and were like, wait, I thought I was supposed to see art in here. This is just like a craft. But again, it's all in that definition. And the artists on campus who did create that had lots of meanings that were inherent, but they also allowed people to make their own interpretations of that. So literature is a field that I want to talk about. So the nature of postmodernism is rejection of universal definition. So we don't really have to trail too far from art to understand literature. They're kind of in the same vein, but it gets like a little bit more complicated. So like artists, writers in the early 20th century and earlier, obviously, were held to really strict formalist standards for their work to even be considered literature. So a word that stuck around that I wish hadn't is canon. Oh, is this thing in the canon? Is it in like the club of what we've decided is good literature, is real literature? And the big part of literature, at least in the 19th, early 20th century, was the grand narrative, the grand sweeping Henry James, narrative with a fantastic plot that just, develops gradually and that's full of detail and these sort of hero villain type characters, even if they are more complicated. But one of the most popular ways that people revolutionized, or one of the most revolutionizing figures in postmodernism with literature, is Roland Barthes. And he wrote The Death of the Author. And this is something we commonly use when we talk about postmodern lit, which is killing the author. So he's like one of these daddies of postmodernism. And he grew out of the ashes of the new criticism movement, which I shouldn't even mention because that will take me on a rabbit trail that I know you probably tuned out already, so I'm not even going to do that. But basically, pre-postmodernism, the author had full control over the interpretation, and the author's biography, context, identity, that was what you looked at to understand that piece of literature. And even like their experiences, their biases, etc. But with postmodernism, you just literally killed the author, and there's like a baby wailing. I don't know if you can hear that. I should have closed my window. I'm sorry. We're all doing our best. Where was I? Killing the author. He had a great quote, which I wrote down because I want to get it verbatim. So let me find it. A poem does not belong to its author, rather is detached from birth and goes into the world beyond its power to intend about it or control it. The poem belongs to the public. And so if you've ever taken a literature class or even in high school, maybe there's a little bit more control over what's right and what's wrong in high school. But you could just say, oh, I noticed this thing. Oh, what an interesting word. I wonder if this author was trying to do this with it. We have this full freedom to analyze a work, whereas before, there really was a right or wrong answer, and you could, get your paper is counted off if you had this wild idea about how something connected. My favorite example is a student who wrote several years ago a research paper claiming that Harry Potter, all the characters in Harry Potter are gay, which I don't think is true. I know that J.K. Rowling did not intend that in Harry Potter, but like she argued it well. She brought in quotes and I could see what she meant. She was definitely framing them in a certain way, but it's like, yeah, that's the kind of thing you're allowed to do. That of course is an extreme example, but before that, it just would have been like, no, you have an F. But now if you can see something in there, it exists. Those words belongs to us. This work belongs to us. And the author can't step in and say, "Oh, no, that's not what it is." So it may be difficult to view Mouse like this since the author is obviously very real. He's a character in there. We see him constantly, and also this is a memoir, sort of. That in itself is an indication that actually Mouse is a very postmodern piece. We've talked about genre bending. It's not really a Holocaust narration. It's not really a true memoir. It's an interesting genre all of itself. And so Mouse is tremendously postmodern. And here is, I was going to say here's why, but I actually want you to do that. Here are some of the elements that we can look for in a piece of postmodern work. And not all of these are super present in Mouse, but a lot of them are. And so take note, write down some notes for yourself, because we're going to keep coming back to these. And what you're going to do for this class lesson, class activity, which is going to be due Sunday, is find some element of Mouse that is postmodern in some way. And of course, we are not doing a perfect, I don't know, this isn't a class on critical theory. It's not a class on postmodernism. So we're really just going to look at some exterior definitions. One of the things you can look for is irony and playfulness and black humor, which talking about something serious and adding levity to it. There are moments of humor. I would say even having these characters be mice and pigs is almost silly when you're talking about something as serious as Auschwitz. And even the fact that it's in a comic form. So we can see that kind of genre blending, which for a lot of us, I think, while reading based off of your reading notes, has been a little odd, like enjoying reading this comic and then remembering what you're reading and pulling together all of the history that you have already about Auschwitz and Birkenau and what happens there. And here it's in this cute little comic form. Intertextuality is one of those really fun college words. So it's a combination of different styles. So we have text. So intertext is texts that are interworking together. And sometimes there'll be different points of history or other works of literature. For example, if anybody likes The Handmaid's Tale on HBO, the creator and author, Margaret Atwood, has a whole series where she's doing these retelling of fairy tales, which that's a pretty common a common example of intertextuality that we see a lot, like modern retellings of things, modern retellings of myths. You could look at sort of the Marvel universe almost as being intertextual in that way too. Some other words that go with this, you don't have to ever remember them, but are pastiche and fabulation. Fabulation is kind of a different thing, but pastiche literally just means to combine or to paste. So you could think of intertextual works as like taking these different pieces and literally pasting them together into a unified work. A really big word for us is metafiction. If there was one way that Mouse was postmodern, it is this. So metafiction is essentially writing about writing. So when you say something is so meta, it's sort of being referential. So it's that moment when you're watching a TV show and then they turn to the audience. You're like, what? They're aware of me. They're aware that they're in a TV show. So that thing within a thing. Many of you, hopefully, read or watched Hamlet when you were in high school, if you were good high school students. And those of you who did will remember that there's this play that's happening inside of this play. So that's a perfect example of meta. It's like little matryoshkas, those Russian nesting dolls, where there's another thing happening inside of that thing. But it's all referencing and making clear that this is a piece of work. This is a piece of art. This is a piece of writing. Excuse me. So they just want to make it really, really obvious, this artificiality of art. And so it's usually accompanied by referencing the act of writing. Did I not? Let's see. I thought I had, oh man, I had these really good images that I don't think I put in here, but I was really into. I'm just going to put them in really quick because I was really happy with them. So hold on. We'll just do those two. See, this is now meta. I'm working on my lecture while you guys are watching me work on my lecture, and now I'm talking about it. Incredible. Everything is so meta. You also sound like really insufferable if you go around saying like, oh, that's so meta. So I found this wonderful kids book called We Are in a Book, where the characters are aware of what's happening to them. There's a couple movies that have come out recently that have the same thing, where the character is very aware. The narrator talks to the main character and they like look up at the sky. They're like, who's that? Where'd that come from? Or they argue with the narrator. And it's usually done for a purpose of humor. But it's just, again, that freedom that you have as a writer, as a reader, to explore text in a different way. Where's my other little guy? Oh my gosh. Even with form, that's why I was going to show this one. Being creative with form, using spaces quite a bit, or having a character like this. This doesn't come up as much in Mouse. If you like had Vladek like go into one of the frames, like pull himself in, you don't really see. There's a pretty good division between that time that Vladek and Art are talking, and then where the strip itself starts. Man, I am all over the place. Okay. Historical metafiction is a big part of this as well. Obviously, that's what we're dealing with, where there's this, we're talking about history and then seeing history happen, and all of that sort of splicing together. Another term, which I always pronounce incorrectly because I can't do Greek very well, poiomena, refers to a type of metafiction where it's about the process of creation, which we definitely get. We see Art talking about his work. The whole thing is poiomia, where he's like, we see him illustrating, or we see him literally like at his table the first time that we meet him, sitting at his table, drafting table, trying to draw this thing. The last one's fragmentation. And we are definitely dealing with a fragmented narrative, both in time and in space. So 2 different time periods. Sometimes Vladek starts at a different point, and then Art will have to say like, wait, no, but that was this different time. So anytime there's interrupted sequences of events, you could also look at language, though, too. How Spiegelman adopted Vladek's accent is also very fragmented. We have fragmented English, and we read it that way as well. And so another part of this is a temporal distortion, when there's multiple possible events occurring at the same time. And one part of this is unreliable narration. We don't know if Vladek's account is correct. We assume that it is, but there's points, especially in the next book of Mouse that we're reading, the end of this, which is all in Auschwitz. It gets pretty brutal. So we're gonna have to like really focus on our good vibes board next week. You see him forgetting a lot of things. And there's lots of reasons for this. He's older. It's been a long time. That was tremendously traumatic. But fact is not a given in this narration. And there's really like not any certainty. There's no way for us to check it. So what we could be reading is incorrect. So even Art's biased. He's representing these events in places he's never witnessed firsthand. And we're going to watch a video next week that's footage of Art going to Auschwitz and these towns for the first time, and he's literally comparing like, oh wow, I thought this was like way bigger when I drew this. So he's even like, so much of this is he's making up, he's filling in the blanks, and that's a really big part of temporal distortion. And so if there's moments you see where it's like, oh, how would Art know this? Is this maybe being, incorrectly positioned, incorrectly drawn? Did he try to fill in the blanks from his father's fragmented narrative? Those are good areas for us to look at. But Spiegelman never promises us like an entry in a history textbook, and there's these flaws in his character, as you guys noted in Tuesday's discussion board, and you guys pulled out some great stuff, which intentionally cast doubt for us as a reader. And that area of doubt and skepticism is really what postmodernism is all about. So from here on out, filter the reading through this theory, through these terms. We'll get used to applying this lens onto our reading, and by the end of this, be familiar with a lot of different critical theories. That's it's going to be the awkward space where I try to find my mouse and end the